Everybody loves a good creature story. In tonight's video, I will be telling 3 stories of unknown beasts and cryptids. Then I will be closing things off with 2 more interesting and chilling stories. A huge thank you to the writers who allow me to share these stories. They are the ones who make these videos possible, and there are links to where you can find more of their work in the description. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoy the video, likes and comments are always appreciated. Subscribing if you're new is as well. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. We were always told not to venture on Werewolf Road late at night when we were children. But one night we were just too damn determined to know why the teenagers from our small town were so frightened by the unnerving place, that we had to see for ourselves. I had my small backpack loaded with snacks, a flashlight with some batteries, a flare gun with a can of bear spray, and attached to my backpack was my sleeping bag. The 4 of us gathered together behind my cousin's house, who lived just 2 houses down across the street, and together we all exchanged scary legends and stories we had heard about the road and the cemetery on it. I heard there's a woman in the trees who jumps on people's cars late at night. She sleeps on a mattress with her dead, rotting baby. Evan said with a morbid sense of pride in his voice, "That's baloney." My cousin Justin said, shaking his head, "I heard she was just drunk and that happened once. The baby wasn't dead. The police took it from her though," he said in a matter-of-fact tone. "You guys ever hear about the dead puppy in the box my brother found in the cemetery?" I said aloud. The other 3 looked at me, their eyes widening with interest as I spoke up. He said he went up there alone one day, around 2 years ago when we moved here. He said he was walking through the graveyard and near one of the tombstones, there was a purple box. He saw blood on the outside of the box, and grabbed a stick to open it, and there was a dead puppy that someone sacrificed. He looked up and saw streamers in the trees, in an area where it looked like there was a fire. For 4 adolescent boys with active imaginations, you can only picture how terrified we were. There would have been next to no possibility that we would venture out anywhere such as that alone. But together, it was a different story. We were all in this together, despite how frightening it was. "Oh, come on, he's just jacking with you," Ronnie, the youngest of us 4, spouted. I could tell if he was lying, and believe me, he wasn't. He had a look on his face that makes me feel like he wasn't. "Are we gonna do this or not?" Justin said, seemingly irritated by the stories. We each shrugged and picked up our belongings, and next thing we knew, we were walking towards the woods that led to the legendary road on the other side. The leaves and sticks cracked beneath our feet as we stumbled around in the pitch-black summer night. Justin had his flashlight shining ahead of our group. The narrow beam shone the heavy thicket that surrounded us. In some places you could see, even in the absence of light, the silhouettes of fast food litter like styrofoam cups of various sizes, and plastic bottles or discarded cans that were scattered about. I felt the crunch of an empty can of beer under my foot. I cursed under my breath as I realized just how loud and inconvenient my misstep was. Evan turned around and shushed me as we continued walking. "Screw off, Evan," I said in a stern but quiet voice. I raised my hand as he turned forward, the thought crossing my mind to smack the back of his head. I bit my bottom lip and considered how bad that could be for us if the wrong group of people noticed our presence. "Okay, I can see the road. We need to decide right now if we are going to drop our stuff off first and then continue, or if we're going to take everything," Justin said. I looked around at the flat, dry ground that was covered in leaves nearby. "That looks like a perfect area to set up camp," I said, pointing at the spot. We all 4 removed our bags as we walked over to the grounds I chose, setting them down. "Anything valuable any of you might need to grab before we go?" Justin asked. I ran to my bag and grabbed the bear spray, assuming it would be good just in case we ran into some trouble. Ronnie and Evan shook their heads, and continued with him as he moved his flashlight from our newly claimed campsite and headed for the cemetery on Werewolf Road. I quickly caught up to them as we continued. In the humid summer night, there wasn't a sound to be heard besides a barn owl that could be heard in a tree nearby, and our feet lightly moving across the earth. We reached the dirt road, and I raised my head and looked around as what sounded like something heavy fell through a mess of branches. Perhaps a decrepit tree, or a large animal. Whatever that was, it wasn't small, I heard Ronnie say. I looked over at him, and was leaning over his bent knees, wiping his sweaty face off with his dark shirt. He raised up and shook it, attempting to cool off. We four sat in silence. The night now grew more ominous. We stared at the dirt road, and I now looked to the right, remembering the wooden bridge that led to the cemetery. "It's this way," I said. We continued walking. I turned around to notice the rest of the group behind me. Justin still holding the flashlight, but aiming it up in the trees rather than the very dark road ahead. "Justin, can I see the flashlight?" I asked. "Here you go," he said as he quickly stretched his arm out and held it out like the Olympic torch. We approached the wooden bridge. As we came closer, I looked out at the creek, where you could see a pile of dead hogs, perhaps 6 or more, on the creek bed. The stench from their rotting, bloated corpses fouled the air. On the bridge was a pentagram drawn out near the very center. It had been faded from the elements, but you could still see it fairly well. We gathered around it, not saying a thing aloud. "The cemetery is just up the road," I said. We continued across the bridge, and I noticed that Ronnie turned his head and looked back at the creek, where the dead hogs were. "Did you guys see that? Or smelled at least?" We continued walking, not thinking too much about it. There could have been many reasons for that. Not every little thing had to be unusual, even to young boys who longed for excitement. As we got closer to the cemetery, we noticed a bright light coming from inside its fence. It was a fire. We rushed down the road, trying our best to stay low and keep quiet, as we grew dangerously close to the cemetery. We got off the road and made our way up a ditch, which led us into the woods that surrounded the cemetery fence line. As we lined up to peer through the fence, we were careful to stay low. Embers lingered around the blaze like fireflies in the cemetery landscape, and we watched as these beings gathered around the fire. They weren't human. There hadn't been a chance that they were human at all. They were beastly, savage creatures that were swift on all fours. When they were on the lookout, they stood on their hind legs and perched, exposing their ape-like chests and torsos. The rest of their bodies looked like canine, like a greyhound. Their faces were covered in heavy, beaked masks that looked similar to the surgeon masks worn during the Black Plague, but these were more of a ghastly sight on such already terrifying monsters. I knew we couldn't dare trespass on their fiery territory. I watched as one lurked near a tombstone and dug like a canine into the ground. I listened as we could hear what sounded like gurgling coming from the plot, dirt being thrown viciously behind the creature. The rest of the pack began to gurgle and click their mouths as they walked around the fire. 3 other creatures gathered around the burial plot, where the first creature dug, and the other 3 stood on their hind legs and looked around. I watched as the creature that was now burrowed deep into the ground climbed out of the hole with a rotting arm in its mouth. It sat next to the others, arm between its 2 hands, sniffing. The others gurgled and sniffed in between chirps. Another creature crawled into the hole and came back to the surface with a dismembered leg in its mouth and carried it away from the rest of the group. Justin looked over at the rest of us with a face full of shock, and he spoke very hesitantly in an almost faint whisper, trying his best to control his breathing. "We've got to get the hell out of here. I don't know what those things are, but they aren't people. I say we leave our stuff at the campsite and get back to my place fast." The 4 of us backed away from the fence, and we got as close to the bottom of the ditch as we could. We knew that any little noise from us could be fatal. The sticky summer air attracted unrelenting mosquitoes that swarmed around our ears, and sweaty necks and arms. We tried for our lives to ignore the high-pitched buzz that rang in our ears. As we crept towards the bridge, I heard a gurgling sound in a nearby tree overhead. It rattled and clicked, signaling the others to move in on us. I looked up to see it as, through its frightening mask that covered its disfigured face, it looked down on me with its black, dilated pupils, as I felt the sweat collect in my eyes, and the mosquitoes I refused to sway away bit into my neck. The other 3 were frozen in place, staring at the creature as well. I smelled urine in the air from Ronnie, as he couldn't anymore hold his bladder in fear. I couldn't blame him. There wasn't a moment for ridicule or disparagement. The creature stared into our eyes, and I heard the fence line viciously rattle as the other creatures climbed and jumped it, closing in on our misfortunate, desperate souls. Justin spoke up. "Guys, any ideas?" I slowly reached into my pockets and felt for a lighter. In my other pocket was the big can of bear spray. We let them close in on us, dangerously to our discomfort, but I knew this was an ample opportunity to quickly discharge as much of the can on them as I could while we still had a chance. I watched as the creatures fell on their backs, croaking and clicking their tongues with this very awful and loud scream that came out in between gurgles and rattles. They nervously clicked more after this. The creature in the tree appeared to fear jumping. It leapt in the opposite direction, scurrying near the cemetery fire. We quickly rushed across the bridge, jumping into the creek near the dead hogs, and trudging through the water. It was only 5 minutes or less to Justin's home, the time we counted down together, not allowing failure to escape the grip of such vile and heinous of creatures. We saw the porch light nearby as we entered into the neighborhood. It had been a welcome relief to know that we had arrived finally. As I reached Justin's patio under the floodlights, I took a moment to catch my breath. I turned my head to look around, and I realized that I had been the only one who reached my cousin's backyard. I called out each of their names, but without success. I waited around 5 minutes, when I saw the beam of Justin's flashlight shine into the backyard from over the fence. I watched as him and Evan, and Ronnie, boosted each other over his fence as I continued to walk over to them and ask them what exactly kept them so long. I watched them, and something seemed different about their demeanors. They each had a look in their eyes that unnerved me. Justin spoke up. "You left us behind. You didn't even let us catch up with you. What the hell were you thinking?" he said angrily. I walked in circles, looking up at the three of them as they stared at me with disapproval nonetheless. After the three of them refused to talk to me that night, I finally decided to walk home. As I got to my room, I quickly stripped to my boxers and fell into my bed. I woke up around 8:30 in the morning to my father calling out to me from his office, and he said, "Tyler, come here right now." I walked into my father's office. I watched as he held his bald fist over his mouth, leaning back in his leather chair. He ran his other hand through his hair and looked at me. "Your cousin and your friends are missing. What happened last night?" I thought about it for a moment, but hesitated on giving a full disclosure. "We just hung out till early this morning, and then I came home around 1 o'clock this morning. They were there when I left." "Did you go anywhere with them? Or did they have somewhere they wanted to go?" He leaned forward. "The only place we went to was the cemetery on Werewolf Road." I have a friend who is a hobbyist photographer. I'll call her Susan. She particularly enjoys urban decay, young trees framed through shards of broken glass in a window frame, their leaves translucent neon green in the sunlight, collapsed roofs sagging like a discarded blanket, shingles heavy with moss, a thin stalk of an unidentifiable plant, bearing only 2 leaves at the top, growing from the pocket a screw should go on, a discarded sign. I enjoy the genre as well. There's something alluring in those pictures, a haunting, ethereal nature, the echo of lives that have long left the scene. There's hope, mingled with subdued terror, at the aggressive reclamation by nature. A sign that life persists when human life has left, and a reminder that nature will claim everything she can, and nothing is sacred from her grasp. Susan is aware that I enjoy urban decay, and has repeatedly suggested I go with her on her photography trip someday. For a while I resisted because, well, I prefer to follow rules. You know that person that won't jaywalk and waits for the crosswalk light even though there's no traffic in sight? Yeah, that's me. I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but that's just how I am. I like things to follow patterns and laws. Deviance makes me anxious. Like for a brief moment my comforting illusions are drawn back, and I can see the chaotic, innate unfairness that is our world. I'm reminded that life doesn't make sense, and it terrifies me. Or maybe I just don't want to be the next Florida man by doing something dumb and easily avoidable. Susan finally prevailed on me last month, despite my reservations. "It's a small building," she said, set back off the main road in an empty stretch of land between the edge of the suburbs and the next town. The very fringe of urban sprawl, like the city spread out its reach, and then drew in a breath and withdrew, leaving behind vacant shells and shattered parking lots. Isolated, so there wouldn't be police to chase us off. Small and still in decent shape, so there wouldn't be any fear of environmental hazards. I hesitated, hovering on my refusal, as she countered every argument I could have presented. Certainly it would be trespassing, but it would be safe trespassing, the sort that no one really cares about. Besides, it wasn't like we were teenagers sneaking inside to drink $5 bottles of vodka. She had her camera. We were respectable. I try not to be a killjoy sometimes. I asked what the building was exactly. A car wash, she said. I heard the glee in her voice. A car wash? I repeated. I didn't quite share her enthusiasm, as it seemed like such an odd building to explore. But perhaps that was why she was excited. An absurdity, the silent brushes hanging in tatters, birds nesting in the machinery, the rust stains on the tire rails. Even if there weren't any good photographs to take, I thought, it'd be an interesting experience. And the building is small, so we wouldn't be there long. We met up the next day in the late afternoon. There were still a few good hours of sunlight left. I dropped my car off in the parking lot for a shopping center that was still functional, and then hiked along the shoulder of the road to where the car wash sat. Susan had parked her car behind it, where it was hidden from the road, which I admitted was a wiser choice than my decision to simply hike over. Or perhaps my friend parked there so she could have a clear shot of the front of the building, and hadn't given any thought as to whether someone would see her car and call the police. I certainly had. I'd fretted about it, staring at Google Maps, wondering if perhaps I was overthinking this, and that no one would actually care if there were 2 cars parked outside an abandoned building. But I couldn't help but worry, and so I wound up walking what felt like half a mile instead. The building was unremarkable on the outside, khaki brick, rust stains framing where a sign over the entrance had once gone. The car wash bay gaped open, the interior dim, and the other half of the building was a featureless expanse, devoid of windows, with only a thin metal door that hung half open. The rolling doors to the bay were removed, so the only glass littering the lots was from discarded bottles. Susan told me that she hoped to get into where the mechanicals were. Copper scavengers had probably already come through here, and if so, they'd have broken that door open and done the hard work for us. I didn't share her enthusiasm. It hadn't occurred to me that we'd force our way into anything. Didn't this count as breaking and entering? She took photos of the exterior and then moved into the bay, with only a few hours of sunlight, so she wanted to get those areas done first, as we'd have to use flashlights inside the office portion, regardless of what time of day it was. I hovered nearby, my enjoyment of urban decay buried under the weight of my anxiety. I think that's why I heard the noises first. They came from the other side of the plywood that covered the windows all down the interior wall, fluttering like wings. And then a soft thump of something striking the wood and bouncing off. I think there's birds inside the office, I said. Or bats, Susan replied, not even looking in my direction. Engrossed with the metal frame of the car wash, the shutter of her camera clicked a couple times, and I heard the fluttering again. I'm gonna go look, I said. I may be anxious about breaking rules, but I have no fears regarding bats or birds, or any other kind of animal commonly found in a suburban setting. Nor am I a superstitious person. I don't buy into folklore about monsters, and I assume every supernatural occurrence has a logical explanation. Human perception is a fragile, weak-willed thing, easily influenced and deceived. There may be monsters inside. Was never among my multitude of concerns about entering the car wash. Why should it be? That is not a rational concern. It sounded like a bird or a bat. I like both birds and bats. I went to go see which it was. Susan had suggested bringing leather gloves, just in case there was broken glass to deal with. I had those, along with long pants, long sleeves, and my leather hiking boots. I put those on as I walked to the door, leading to the building's interior. I was hoping for bats, honestly, and knew better than to have contact with them with bare hands. Obviously, I wouldn't be posting here if it was just bats that I found inside. The door stood open barely a foot. I edged it farther out, positioning myself so that if anything bolted, it would have been a clear shot to the outdoors. Nothing came out, but the rustling inside went silent. I waited a minute, then stepped around the door to look inside. The interior was stripped clean of furniture, and there was little debris. Some decaying magazines in a corner, and broken beer bottles. Clumps of plaster fallen from the walls or ceiling. An acid smell of animal urine. I took shallow breaths through my mouth, and ran my flashlight along the corners of the ceiling, looking for bird nests or the glitter of black eyes staring back at me. Nothing. I went to the next door, leading farther into the building. I reasoned that this was their front office, perhaps if they had to deal with an irate customer, and I'd find some more rooms in the back. A break room, maybe, and I wasn't quite certain what else would be inside a car wash. I didn't find out either, for as I pushed the next door open, I found myself at the edge of a pit. The collapse started at the opposite side of the building, a straight drop for perhaps 7 feet. Broken pipes protruding from the soil and cement. It sloped gradually upwards to where I stood, the floor forming a shattered ramp down into the darkness. My view of the bottom was obscured by the broken remains of walls, lying in heaps of jagged plaster and splintered wood. This was where I decided to turn back, climbing down into a clearly unstable hole with just a flashlight to light my path. Was a bad decision. I ran the beam of light up and down the far end of the pit, trying to see if this is where the bats were nesting. And just at the lip of the hole I caught the reflection of tiny, beady eyes that shone in the light like stars. Neat, I thought. Definitely bats. Then something hit me from behind. Something large. Something strong. And the blow to my back knocked the air from my lungs and threw me forwards into the pit. I lost my footing immediately and fell, hitting the ground on my shoulder, and I tumbled a bit before smashing up against a pile of broken lumber. I tried to suck in air, but my diaphragm seemed frozen with a thick knot of pain just under my sternum. My flashlight had landed elsewhere, pointed uselessly at the wall of the pit, and the only other light was a thin line of sunlight from the open door in the room beyond. I was cold with fear and the sudden rush of adrenaline, like a current of electricity running through my body. I stared at the lip of the pit above me, searching for movement of whatever had hit me, but nothing came. Nothing but the rush of wings from behind. Something cool and alive landed on my neck. I slapped at it instinctively, my chest releasing enough that I could utter a weak cry of surprise. Then another landed on my back, and I felt tiny claws clinging into my shirt. I reached up and back, trying to shoo it away, for I still thought it was a bat. And then there was a flash of pain at the collar of my shirt as teeth sank into my skin. I yelped, flailed at it, trying to dislodge it without hurting it, because I didn't want to kill a small animal that didn't pose a real threat. And my fingers brushed against thick, leathery skin, along strange ridges on its back, and the spot where it had bitten me began to burn and itch, and it wasn't letting go. I felt a long, bony tail curl against my torso. It wasn't a bat. I don't know what it was, but it was not a bat. And then another landed on my leg and started clawing and biting, trying to puncture through my jeans, and I no longer cared about not trying to hurt small animals. I grabbed at it, thinking I'd throw it across the room. My fingers closed on empty air as it jumped away with a rush of movement from its wings. Then another one hit at the small of my back. I felt it scrambling for purchase and I twisted, reaching for it, as another landed on my neck and bit down. They were coming from all angles now. As soon as I slapped one away, another landed. They couldn't get through my jeans, but they were starting to puncture my shirt, and my neck and face were entirely unprotected. I yelled, loudly, trying to startle them, and I struggled to stand, thinking that if I had just got out of here, away from their nest, I could get them off me and they wouldn't keep coming. I stumbled on the broken terrain, blind in the darkness, struggling to crawl upwards while fending off the buzzing, whirling mess of claws and wings from my exposed neck and face. I felt blood trickling down my back from the bites that had already been made, and there were a couple I simply could not dislodge, clinging to my back where I couldn't reach. My heart hammered in my chest and I felt panic clawing at my mind, silently screaming with revulsion at the touch of those creatures and the feel of their teeth on my skin. Like leeches, I thought. Gigantic, flying leeches. I heard Susan calling my name from the entrance of the building, asking if I was okay, that she'd heard a yell. "No, I'm not okay," I yelled back. "Don't come in, just call for help." I was being swarmed. Already, I could feel myself sliding back towards the pet, weighed down by the creatures clinging to my jeans, and the air was filled with the buzz of their wings. They'd swarm Susan too, and then there'd be no one left to help. I knew she was hesitating, thinking she should be the good friend, and ignore my pleas to stay where it was safe, so I yelled up at her that I meant it. Better that they only had to rescue one of us, and to please trust me that she couldn't help me by herself. "I'm dialing 911, she called out. "What do I tell them?" I didn't get a chance to reply. There was a resounding impact, one that shook the walls of the building, and the thin silver of sunlight vanished. Susan screamed my name and pounded on the door. I heard the rattle of the handle. I heard her kicking it, and then those things surged back out of the darkness, descending from the air, and I was hit by a veritable blanket of flesh and claws. I collapsed onto my stomach, writhing, and I tucked my chin to my chest, and covered the back of my neck with one hand, and my face with my other arm. I kicked as they found the hem of my jeans and nuzzled past it to the exposed flesh on my ankle. I flipped onto my back when they punctured my shirt, and then back onto my side when they went for my stomach instead. Then fingers closed over my wrist. Bony fingers, like being gripped by the branches of a tree, and I felt the light touch of claws where they ended. The hand generously encircled my wrist, far larger than any human hand, and I cried out in pain as its grip ground my bones together. The creature pulled, dragging my arm away from my face, and it was as if all my resistance were nothing. My muscles strained but could not break from the creature's grip. It hoisted up, dragging me with it, pulling me from the ground so that I could not get my feet under me, so that I could not fight back, so that I could not protect my torso or my neck or face. I have nightmares about this, every other day perhaps, of screaming, dangling like bait on a line, there in the darkness surrounded by the buzz of wings, and covered in points of pain as their teeth latched into my flesh. I wanted to faint, to pass out, to not know what was happening, to just go away until the police or someone arrived to help. That was my only hope, that Susan had called 911, and I only had to survive long enough. There was a crash, an impact of something against the door. I had gone limp, exhausted by my struggles, body trembling and lungs heaving. Another crash, and the thin line of sunlight returned. The thing holding me let go and I fell heavily to the ground, still covered in the smaller creatures, and I heard the crunch of grit as it slunk away, down into the darkness. Men yelling, the unsteady bounce of light from flashlights. They poured into the room, I'm not sure how many, and I was blinded by the light they showed down on me. I heard one of them swear softly. They called to me, said to just keep still, and they'd get some equipment from the truck and get them off. They brought in a floodlight and filled the room with lights, and the hovering creatures, the ones hiding in the corners, avoiding the flashlights, fled down into the pit. Then they carefully approached where I lay, and one asked me my name. I told him. "Okay, you're talking, that's good," he said, audibly relieved. "We're going to get these things off you, but they've latched on and pulling them off is going to take big chunks of you with them, so we're not going to do that. We've got a chemical solution we're just going to douse you with instead. It'll sting like hell, and you'll feel like you got a bad sunburn, but it'll kill these, okay?" I don't think he was actually asking my permission, but I nodded weakly anyway. They brought a bucket and dumped it over me, telling me to close my eyes and to hold my breath. It burned like peroxide on my open wounds, and I whimpered in the back of my throat, but I felt those things cling to my body shrivel and then fall away. The men hoisted me to my feet, checked to make sure there were none left, and then began escorting me up and out of the building. They almost had to carry me. My legs were shaking and I felt like I couldn't keep my feet under me, like my body was sluggish to respond. I glanced back once and saw a pale, leathery creature curled up in a ball like a roly-poly, its long tail wrapped around and around its corpse. The police were arriving just as we exited the building, along with an ambulance. Even in my daze, I thought this was odd. Susan stood nearby, clutching her phone and crying. One of the men had her camera and was looking through the photos on the view screen. None of them wore uniforms, and their white pickup truck had no insignia. But as the police approached, with the paramedics just behind, one of them pulled a badge out of his back pocket and flashed it, and everyone just started acting like they were in charge. I still don't know what government agency they belonged to. I asked at one point and they told me they were part of the EPA, and I keep thinking that had to be a joke, and I was just too drugged at the time to laugh. I was in the hospital for 5 days. A couple of the lacerations required stitches, and my skin turned red and peeled, like a bad sunburn all over my body. I was given IV painkillers, along with some other medicine that made me horrifically nauseous, and I spent a bit of time in the bathroom puking, dragging the IV pole with me each time my stomach rebelled against its contents. I was questioned very softly after the hospital was done processing me through the ER, and had me admitted to a room. I vaguely recognized the man. He'd been one of the two helping me walk out of there. They'd already talked to Susan, he said. And they knew about the whole Urban Decay photography thing. He wanted to know why I'd gone into the building's office. I told him I thought they were bats. That's a common mistake, he said, nodding sagely. Well, they're not. They're like winged piranhas. First appeared 5 years ago, and now they're all across North America. They've got paralytic venom in their bites, and it's especially effective against humans. I asked why this wasn't public knowledge. He just shrugged and said that it wasn't his decision to make. I felt he was being evasive. He moved on quickly from the topic, telling me that they'd been watching the car wash for a few days now, trying to decide the best way to discreetly eliminate the nest. Something had tampered with their camera though, and they'd lost signal. They'd been trying to get it back, thinking it was a problem on their end. When the police scanner picked up officers being dispatched to the car wash, that's when they all jumped in the truck and hauled to get over there. We didn't touch your cameras, I said. I didn't even see them. I asked if this is why people were encouraged to stay out of abandoned buildings. He hesitated, then said that no. Typically those things didn't move into urban areas. They were more an issue in rural areas, where they'd prey upon livestock before moving on to humans, giving them a narrow window of time in which to locate the nest and eliminate it before people were hurt. It was unusual, and concerning, to find them this close to the city. Probably climate change. He quipped grumpily. I feel he was only half joking. And the big one? I asked. Is that normal too? He went quiet for a moment, then asked me in a soft, calm voice what I meant by the big one. So I told him about how something had hit me, slammed the door shut, and then pulled my hands away from my face and held me up from the smaller ones to feed. His expression tightened as I spoke. He told me not to worry, that they'd dealt with this situation before, but he looked grim and he quickly excused himself and went into the hallway, dialing on his cell phone as he left. I strained to listen in as he talked. I didn't hear much of their conversation, just this fragment that buried itself into my mind. Burn it to the ground, he said. We're out of time. They've matured. A week after I was released from the hospital, I drove past the car wash. It's gutted, a pile of charred timber, and the blackened metal frame of the machinery is all that was left standing upright. I went inside a nearby store and bought something I didn't need, and asked the cashier what happened. He wasn't sure, he said. It just went up one evening. He'd heard rumors of it being an electrical fire. I haven't been specifically told not to talk about this. Perhaps the people that saved me are getting tired of operating in the shadows, of showing up too late, because people don't know and go into the dark in search of bats. Or perhaps my silence was implied, but I'm a little more comfortable about breaking the rules now. I think at some point the government will have to say something. If they're moving into more densely populated areas, then it's only a matter of time before the general public starts to notice there's something new among us. They'll have to respond, tell us what they are, where they came from, and what to do about them. But until that happens, just stay out of abandoned buildings. We sat around the same sturdy wood table at which my father and his father had dined during their wintry trips to the cabin in his boyhood. My mother hadn't been before, though my sister and I had visited with our father 2 years prior, when he first taught us to hunt. I was 13 then, my sister 9. Now, older and somewhat more accustomed to the frigid air, we assured our mother that the weekend ahead wouldn't be so bad. Our mother hated the cold, and had similarly unwelcome feelings for those who comfortably dealt within the northernmost areas of our state. Seasons were peculiar here, I'll give her that much. Winter came not as a gradual decay, and discernible onset of frost, but as a sudden coat, blasted onto nature and man, as if spewed from some furnace. Temperatures, though severe, were not comparable to the biting Arctic winds elsewhere, and so my mother, after insistent pleading on our part, accompanied us to the ancestrally past cabin. For the first time in my father's lineage, a complete family dined around the ice-armored roof. To our surprise, our bachelor uncle had been waiting for us when we arrived at the cabin, and requested that he could join us for one last meal before he returned home. He made himself the steward of the cottage, since his home was only a few miles away, and kept its upkeep during the summer months. We gladly agreed. considering his presence a cherished opportunity. We rarely visited due to my mother's aforementioned distaste of the region. At dinner, macaroni and cheese, beef brisket, oven-fresh bread, and thick green beans filled our plates, and the adults had their glasses filled with wine, while my sister and I drank a warming cider. A fire burned in the humble fireplace in the back of the room, and the windows offered gracious views of the white-capped trees and unclaimed wilderness behind. When night arrived, my father and uncle were visibly drunk, and my mother maintained a semblance of composure, though if observed closely, it was plainly obvious that she had been touched by the liquor. My sister and I exchanged mischievous glances, with the adults drunk and engaged in the kind of conversation only enjoyable to those in that state. Largely referential and nostalgic, us children could have our own sort of fun. My sister, Mackenzie, and I snuck from our seats and made our way towards the back window, careful to pantomime expressions of wonder and intrigue at the rustic decor of the cabin. Things we had seen before, yet towards which we feigned intense concentration. Our ruse was successful, and the adults paid us no attention as they laughed and spoke of times well before my birth. I let her out the window first, so that I could be sure our exit was not noticed. When I heard her land lightly on the snow a few feet below, I climbed through the window and fell beside her, noiselessly. Despite my larger size, I was adept at sneaking out. A learned finesse, I suppose. We made our way down the path from the cabin and onto the tree line, where the cabin's front porch light ended, as if halted by the impenetrable black of the woods. A weak moonlight fell upon the trees, but its dim aura did not reach the forest floor, and being mere children, we didn't dare cross the threshold into the absolute dark. My sister built a sort of throne for herself from the snow, and after seeing how comfy it looked, I followed suit, erecting mine with wide armrests and a high back, proclaiming myself Queen of Frost. We sat, shivering though not opposed to the cold. The fire that burned within the cabin heated the small building a bit too well, and we discussed the things sisters are likely to discuss. Despite her age, my sister had a rather sensitive, well, let's call it awareness of presence and intent. If an argument were likely to arise between my mother and father, my sister would warn me well before any hostile words were flung. If a group of girls at school planned to ridicule us about our, as they said, shifty nature, she'd find me before a confrontation occurred. It was somewhat true, though, what they said about us. I was pretty light-footed, and my sister's hyper-perceptiveness caused her to be a sort of pariah among her peers, when she'd make eerily acute guesses at their feelings or state of mind. I'm not sure why we were gifted with these weird abilities, if that's the appropriate word for them. Once the cold had woven itself into the fabric of our clothing and made its presence at last felt, we demolished our thrones. No one but us could sit upon the seats of ice, and made our way back to the cabin. As my sister climbed, I saw her body tense, and she paused mid-mantle. A sigh escaped her, and she turned around. Her stare went past me, and I turned to find the focus of her gaze. I didn't see anything on the grassless lawn, and couldn't see anything not illuminated by the porch's light. I remember being 11, dim-witted and wild, never serious for more than a moment, when warnings and punishments came to me, otherwise as playful and uncaring, of worldly troubles as a dog. So, when my sister breathed those words, that seemed drowned in gloom, I was understandably taken back. There's someone coming towards us, someone pretending to be a man. By the look in her eyes and the grim, flat cadence of her voice, I hadn't the slightest inclination to doubt her words. She turned and scrambled into the cabin, and I followed quickly behind, neither of us making any effort to conceal our re-entry. Our parents and uncle were sitting on a couch facing the window through which we entered, and by their startled though still drunk expressions, they hadn't noticed our absence. We quickly explained ourselves and politely, as possible for scared children, retold what Mackenzie had seen. Our parents were well aware of Mackenzie's unique traits, though our uncle had no such knowledge, and laughed at my sister's portent. My father needed only to look at my uncle in this peculiar stern way to silence the laughing man. The adults locked and shuttered the windows, and the fire was rekindled, a hunting rifle on the mantel above the fireplace, and my father retrieved it and handed it to my uncle, who had been the least intoxicated of the adults. My mother suggested moving the couch in front of the door, and even though my father believed my sister's story, he didn't feel that preparing for a siege was entirely necessary. Despite his apparent confidence, the light knock at the door seemed to startle him, the same as if it had been a fierce pounding. Our uncle did what everyone does to the bolt of a rifle to prepare it for firing, a noise that rang a bit too loud in the winter quiet, and my father went to the door. He called out, and was responded by a voice which had it none of the roughness you'd expect of a winter living man. Deeming this to be a good thing, my father unlocked and opened the door, and standing there in the yellow light of the porch was a bald man dressed in a plain brown windbreaker and faded gray jeans. An unkempt, frost-kissed beard covered much of his face. As I've mentioned, my sister was the perceptive one, but it was plain even to me that this man was not someone you'd welcome into your home. His clothing and general appearance were normal enough, but a bit too normal, as if planned, crafted specifically to appear as some stereotype of the region's average inhabitant. Moreover, his voice was the one thing that didn't match the look. It hadn't the weathered tonality, only possible from years of inhaling the sharp, lung-lacing winter air. It sounded new. Imagine a voice to sound like that of an adult, but never spoken aloud, simply forged and held within a newborn lungs, until the time came for it to be expelled. That's what the man's voice sounded like, not necessarily fake, but unaffected and unaltered by the sense of dialect, age, or accent. The adults did not detect this weird aberration. The alcohol had deafened their ears to the strangeness of this visitor's speech, and my father eventually welcomed him to our table, where he sat and told us of his travels through the region. An alleged vehicle had become inoperable somewhere near the mountains, and he hiked along a barely traveled path, which eventually led to the more traversed series of trails that passed by our cabin. My sister and I sat next to each other, hoping that this man and his stories would leave us before bedtime arrived. Our hopes were discarded when our uncle offered the man a sleeping bag and motioned towards a corner of the room near the fireplace. The fire had dwindled to a low ember, and the man offered to reignite the blaze. A box of matches was tossed across the room and caught, and soon a warmth filled the room, though I still felt a peculiar chill tickle my nerves. We were ordered to sleep, and all lights but the fire were extinguished. My sister woke before my uncle's screams escaped his lungs, and I, shortly after its echo reverberated up the mountainside beyond our cabin. In the firelight, I saw the stranger hunched over my uncle, his hands sunk into my uncle's viscera, while my mother watched motionless, horror-struck. My father, last to wake, asked the stranger what he was doing, the full picture not disclosed to him from his perspective near the couch. The stranger let out a sort of chuckle, though the sound was throaty and wet. He turned to my father, and instantly the shades of sleep and inebriation were thrown from his eyes as he beheld the monster's face. I saw it too then, and my sister, though in a state of pure terror, looked at it with what seemed to almost be familiarity. There's someone out there. Someone pretending to be a man, describing his appearance here would only beckon the nightmares that had taken years to seize, so I'll do my best to dance around it, while still imparting the demonic nature of this visitor. Imagine if a man had hundreds of worms, or bugs, or other creepy crawlies beneath his flesh, always writhing and squirming, though never poking through, merely making the flesh roll and bubble, the skin tossing as if a great tide of insects surged within. That was how the man looked at that moment. His skin pulsated and throbbed, everywhere from his wrists to his face, with his clothing pressed to its limits as whatever was contained within pushed and reeled. The most horrible thing of all was that his mouth, which I then saw to be soaked with blood, had expanded to allow an unsettling view into his gullet. Teeth were there, but by their cracked and splintered appearance, hadn't been used for chewing in many years. A sort of geyser churned within the thing's throat, and the interior walls closed and retracted violently, crushing whatever parts the thing had taken from my uncle. Having awoken the rest of us, the thing rose to his feet, and any confidence within my father was obliterated by the thing's newly acquired stature. It stood no less than 8 feet tall, 2 full feet more than it had been mere hours ago, and its throbbing flesh made it seem like some hulking titan. When it spoke, my mother fainted, and my sister cringed as if struck by some invisible blow. My father lost his sense, and began babbling half angry, half terrified. The language was entirely foreign to me. There were traces of some syllables and vocal intonations, roughly assembling the speech of long-dead civilizations I had learned about in school, or perhaps even older and less refined tribes of man. But something else about the speech seemed so distanced from any recorded language, so unnervingly unrecognizable, I won't dare to say alien, in the extraterritorial sense. but it's as good of a guess as any other. It uttered only what I'd guessed could be interpreted as a few words, and then took one heavy step towards us. At that first dreadful footfall, my father's eyes flicked to the rifle on above the fireplace, and then to my sister and I huddled together nearby. The beast stood directly in front of the fireplace and advanced towards us, each step the sound of thunder within the small building. My father leapt past the creature and grabbed the rifle, aiming it at the creature's head, who hadn't made any attempt to stop my father. The first shot struck the creature in the shoulder, and a thick black substance sprayed from the wound and splashed against the couch, burning into the material like acid. The beast slowly turned and my father fired again, striking it in the temple. The bullet entered and stayed, and the creature reacted as if a bug had crawled onto its face. Its fingers patted the vibratory flesh, then found the wound, and fished the bullet out without a single cry or wince. My father must have finally realized the futility of the weapon's use against the beast, because he reversed the weapon's orientation and swung it as a club against the creature, hoping to accomplish something that a bullet couldn't. The weapon shattered against the shoulder of the creature, the splinters thrown throughout the room. At this sound, my mother regained consciousness, and her low groan attracted the attention of the creature. When it turned, my father roared and jumped on the creature's back, his hands attempting to squeeze the thick neck of the monster, but the creature merely strode unimpeded, while my father clung like an insect. It picked up my recovering mother, and with inhuman strength, flung her against the brick wall of the cabin. Her body, as best as I can describe it, exploded upon impact. And I at least had the sense to turn away a millisecond before seeing the debris strewn about the area. My father went crazy then, screaming and biting at the creature, all sense evacuated at the sight of our mother's grisly end. My sister stared, open-mouthed and wide-eyed, as if screaming, though I don't think I heard a single sound escape her lips that whole night. The man-beast removed my father from his shoulders and tossed him casually towards the fireplace, and my father narrowly missed being thrown into the flames. He landed with a single crunch against the wall, and seemed to have broken his back. The beast said something else in that irreproducible tongue, and his eyes melted. Yes, as if reduced from solid orbs to pure liquid, from his face. The flesh around them remained mostly intact, but the eyes drooped like egg yolk, and in the vacant holes, a strange red light grew, as if some infernal energy powered the creature like a hellish golem. My father, barely conscious, turned to my sister and I, his eyes bloodshot and wide, although I assumed he had broken his back in the collision with the wall. He kicked something towards us, and as the creature stepped in front of him and obscured our view, I heard him shout, "Burn it! Burn the damn thing!" I looked down and saw that the object he had kicked was the box of matches we had been using to start the fire. My sister was still paralyzed with shock, leaving me with the burden of action. The creature, either oblivious to us or uncomprehending of my father's command, expressed no indication of thwarting our plan. He placed a heavy foot on my father's chest, and I heard a sharp and pained exhalation of air. I ran to the cabinet where we kept lighter fluid for the grill, and darted back to the creature, and as he slowly and cruelly crushed the life from my father, I doused him in the accelerant. It hadn't noticed my presence until fluid cascaded down its flesh, and I'm not sure if that's owed to my light-footedness, or its ignorance. When it turned and saw me standing there, it gurgled some horrible command, and when I continued squirting the lighter fluid at it, a heavy backhand sent me flying across the room and through a window. I didn't feel the blow immediately. Only after I had landed on the ground did the pain greet me, and I almost fainted from the agony. I had been struck in the chest, and my pain breaths assured me that serious damage had been done. I could feel blood pooling at the base of my throat, forcing me to turn my head and let it fall from my mouth into the snow. I was debilitated beyond movement, at least for the moment, and couldn't accomplish the task given to me by my father. As I lay there, broken and fading, I felt a surge of warmth and an accompanying sheen of light illuminate the front of the cabin. A horrible, feral scream exploded into the night, and to this day, I have yet to erase it from my memory. If hell itself could let out a singular infernal cry in which all the voices of its tortured souls were contained, the beast's wail would make the damnable choir seem a child's lullaby by comparison. I couldn't set up to look into the cabin, but I knew that Mackenzie had achieved what my father desired. My thoughts were confirmed moments later, when I felt her sit next to me, silent and unmoving. I don't know how long we sat there, feeling the heat of the blaze radiate from the burning cabin, because I lost consciousness shortly after the beast's screaming had subsided. I woke in a hospital bed, Mackenzie at my side, asleep in a chair. I was told that at some point in the night, my sister had regained her sense and called the authorities, who arrived and transported us to the hospital. The police reported although they found the charred remains of the adults, they hadn't seen any indication of a fourth body. They had no explanation of the state of my mother's body, and the wounds suffered by my father and uncle, yet would not attribute them to the attacks by what my sister and I had foolishly dubbed the Animal Man. We insisted at his presence for only a short while, too bewildered, too traumatized to argue. We were released into the custody of a kind yet dull-minded adult, on my mother's side. I was also told that due to my injuries, I would suffer from labored breathing for the rest of my life. Even the doctors had picked up on the aloofness of my Aunt Leanne, and directed their instructions for my recovery to my sister. They explained that I would need assistance in day-to-day matters, and would require a protracted prescription of pain-numbing medication. I didn't mind that. The physical injuries weren't distressing. It was what I had seen that still gives me real trouble to this day, 3 years later. I relate my story now because of a call I received only minutes ago from my sister, who went out to retrieve my prescriptions. Before the call was abruptly ended, she had said, "I think it's whole again. I think it knows that I can see it for real. I keep seeing things pretending to be men. They've been following me. If something happens to us, let this record be a warning to everyone who reads it. Listen to anyone with highly perceptive or precognitive abilities. If they speak of things similar to those in this narrative, I doubt the odious creature with lambent eyes is the only horror out there." About 2 years ago, my friends and I drove a couple hundred miles north to see my friend at college. After a fun weekend, we started heading back home. Friend 1 drove and friend 2 sat next to him, while I sat in the back seat by myself. For the sake of convenience, friend 1 will be Nate, and friend 2 will be Sam. During this time in my life, I had really bad depression, which caused me to have very inconsistent sleep cycles. And so it was very normal for me to just sleep for hours on end at random times of the day. After a few hours of us driving, I felt the tiredness kick in, so I laid down in the back and fell asleep. I think maybe a few hours had passed when I groggily half woke up to the sound of a woman's voice. Her voice sounded soft but close by. I don't think I'd remember what she was saying, even if she had been speaking louder anyhow. I was still very tired at that point, and could barely open my eyes. I knew the car had stopped, but seeing that the sun was shining in my face, I knew we still had a bit of time until we were home. I didn't even bother looking at the time in the car, or out the window to see where we were. I figured we had just made a pit stop, and that maybe the woman outside was talking to Nate or Sam. A few seconds later, with my eyes still closed, I can tell something or someone was by the window, because the sun stopped shining on my face. The car then starts moving again, and I immediately fall back asleep. A few more hours pass, and I wake up gasping for air. I sit up and see Sam and Nate looking back at me, confused. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you." "I was just trying to wake you up. Are you okay?" Sam asks. "Yeah, I don't know. That was weird," I responded. At this point, Nate tells me we're back at his place, and that we should just crash at his place since it's already so late. And he doesn't know if he can stay awake enough to drive us to our respective homes. We get out of the car and go inside his apartment. I get some work done on Nate's laptop for a few hours while they sleep, and eventually I fall asleep too. It's the next day, and I'm the first to wake up. When I see Nate come out of his room, I ask them both how the drive back down was. "Do you remember anything about the drive?" Sam asked me with a strange look on his face. "No, I slept through most of it. I just know we had a pit stop, right?" I respond. Nate then proceeds to tell me that about 3 hours into the drive, the GPS started glitching, and it had him going off on some weird side road. Eventually, we ended up driving down some narrow road in a small rural town area. The GPS kept telling us to keep going straight, but the road at the point was practically just dirt, Nate explained. I can't explain why, but I just felt so uncomfortable, so I stopped the car and made a U-turn to get back onto the freeway. That's probably when you woke up. After that, the GPA rerouted and everything was fine. "What was wrong with this town?" I ask. "It was eerie," Sam responds. "The houses just looked so 1950s, and there were absolutely no other cars or people in sight." "Weren't one of you talking to a woman outside, though?" I asked, confused. "No, we literally stopped for like 5 seconds. We didn't even leave the car. We were afraid," Sam responds. I then tell them that I could have sworn that I heard a woman's voice outside. Upon me saying that, they both just looked at each other and froze. I tell them it was probably the radio or just my imagination, but I could tell they still felt really shaken up about that drive. I didn't tell them about how I felt someone stand by the car window while the car was stopped. I think it would freak them out too much if I did. I think I also like to tell myself that it was just a tree or just my imagination, that something blocked the sun from my window for those few seconds before we drove away. Since then, I've gone up and down that freeway a few more times, sometimes with Nate or Sam, sometimes with another friend. Nate tells me that he still looks out for where on the freeway we might have taken a wrong turn, but he can never seem to find it. Sam once thought we took a wrong turn and ended up on that strange road again, but the road eventually took him onto another big freeway, much to his relief. I can say I feel afraid of this little town the way Nate and Sam are. At first, I thought they might have just been pulling my leg about all this, but every time the topic comes up, they seem more nervous than I've ever seen them. I guess I'll never know what happened that day. The GPS glitched and had us veer off. I stared at myself in the mirror, suddenly realizing that I'm a stranger to the man I see in the filthy mirror's reflection. I studied the battle scars and scabs that plagued my face and neck. The teeth in my mouth that remained looked like chiseled pieces of candy corn that were turning my gums a disgusting color I can't exactly describe. I looked down at my naked arms and legs and saw tracks of holes in my rough skin from the countless times I guess I had shot up heroin without my own realization. All this I realized for the first time today. The place I woke up in was a complete mystery all the same. From the bathroom, I could smell the room and it was awful. Through the cracked doorway, I could see that the hotel room was a complete wreck. I could hear very loud screaming of a woman in the next room, and a man yelling back even louder. The two had been shifting heavy objects around the room, and once in a while I could hear a pounding sound, followed by the shaking wall behind the large, outdated Zenith television set that rested on a cheap dresser nearby. I now had long, dark brown hair and round glasses, resembling a white trash John Lennon. I took one last look at myself in pure shock as I continued into the room. I caught myself in the middle of almost tripping over something heavy when I looked down and found a woman's body stretched out on the floor, head facing up. She hadn't been dead long. I saw in her mouth bits of throw up, and I immediately knew she choked on her own vomit during an overdose. I should have felt like a monster, but I hadn't any clue how I got to this place, and I knew I couldn't be guilty of anything because this wasn't even me. What seemed incriminating was that I didn't even know who I was before. I still could hear the neighbors next door screaming about something I couldn't understand. I couldn't understand anything, as though I were in a scenario too complex to understand. It was nonetheless ironic and somehow comical, how I could be in such a devolved state of existence for such a complex situation. I decided to run out of the hotel room with nothing but a pair of shorts on, and the cleanest shirt I could find. I found that in the hallway I was stepping over homeless people of different shapes, sizes, and degrees of intoxication. Some raised their arms out towards me as I hopscotched my way through the building. Babies cried, couples screwed, and tweakers mindlessly babbled aloud to themselves, some exchanging sketchy looks of distrust and hate as I made my way outside. I watched the emergency exit sign flash in a blood-red blinking of letters. In the dark end of the hallway, I ran to the door, and for whatever reason, it seemed entirely too heavy to open. I shoved at it, and I slammed my balled fists into it, trying so hard to get out, but the doors were closed. I figured I could find an employee around who could maybe help me get outside. I found the hotel clerk, an elderly man in a suit. I explained to him that the door wouldn't allow me to go outside. He shook his head and raised his hands up. "You must exit through the other set of doors," he said as he gently pointed to a hallway nearby. I walked to the hallway and found a set of stairs leading up, and to the right of the staircase were a second set of doors. I quickly ran over and shoved one door open. Someone's hand shoved me through, and I screamed aloud as I felt my body weight and gravity work against me as I fell downward. I knew I wasn't dreaming. My body was actually falling in a complete absence of light all around. It was void of any sound, not even my own scream as I continued, anticipating impact. There was, finally, an impact, and it was very painful at that. I was completely winded, but miraculously I stood and realized I was back near the clerk's desk. The old man nowhere to be seen, but I did hear him, and it sounded as though he was struggling to breathe. I figured it to be a heart attack and found him behind his desk, clenching his throat, where a mess of blood ran through his fingers. His eyes wide and his face was changing to a red and purple. I looked down at my tight fist, and there was a knife covered in blood. It was the clerk's. I gasped in shock, mind boggled by not just one body from a woman I allowed to overdose, but now there was this man who had been fine moments before, but now he was dying. I dropped the knife and tried to save him, but I watched as his body completely relaxed and the life escaped from his eyes. I raised up and quickly stumbled up the stairs, where I believe my room had been previously. There hadn't appeared to be one soul in the same hallway that was once filled with people, but the place was nonetheless still run down and filthy. I found the door to the room I had been in. It was weak enough for me to kick open, so I made my way inside, seeing the young, dead lady I found earlier sitting up on the bed with a cheap spoon in one hand, a lighter with a flame lit in the other hand. She took it under the spoon. I quickly ran. She hadn't said a word or even seemed bothered by my presence. "Hey, don't do that. You're gonna OD," I shouted. As I ran over to her, I saw another dead body on the ground. It was a young man, someone who looked so familiar to me from once before. I turned him over and I quickly looked up at her as she drew the junk into the syringe, and I looked back down at him. And I had a strong suspicion that I knew him better than I knew the new me. Whatever world I was in now, it didn't make any sense. I haven't the slightest clue why I'm here, but maybe I'll trade bodies with different people, and the goal in mind is that we will all figure out each other's stories that brought us here to begin with, and why we keep dying in a vicious cycle. I don't know if we'll ever return to our normal selves in the normal world, but there is clearly no escaping as of right now.